Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gareth Preece. I'm from Resilience UK, community interest company. We're just welcoming people in from the waiting room, so I'll just give it 2 or 3 more seconds, and then we'll just get going. Um, Very pleased to be able to deliver this presentation workshop today, and I hope it's a useful hour. We're going to have people on mute to begin with. If you've got any questions, there are a couple of polls, but also if you want to ask any questions along the way, feel free to put it in the chat, and my colleagues at the institution will pick it up. And with that, I will just get going. So we're talking about data today and how we use data in supporting communities and community resilience in general. So let me just give you a quick overview. As I said, I'm Gareth Preece. I run Resilience UK. We're a relatively new community interest company spun out of a consulting firm. So my consulting business developed online maturity models and diagnostic tools, and we applied this knowledge to community resilience. We started focusing on flooding, and we've expanded it to cover all emergency events now. And yeah, it's a great privilege to be able to share some of the work we've been doing. So we've been going as a community interest company since October last year, but the Community Resilience Maturity Index, this has been a 2-year journey, just over 2-year journey for me so far. So just to start, I'm going to ask, we're going to do our first poll and just ask a really broad question about where the organisations that you represent or yourselves, are you engaged in communities? Do you take part in community engagement as part of the process or as a specific job? And so I am thinking examples. I work with house building communities, and they have community relation officers and so on. So it'd just be interesting to know who's already engaged with communities. Brilliant. Can see those responses coming in thick and fast. Thank you for that. Excellent. Okay, so we're looking at roughly at the moment, sort of hovering around the 75–80% mark, with most of you having responded. Thank you very much. Excellent. So let me just share those results. Brilliant. Okay. That's great. So 75% engaging communities. If we're able to, I don't know if the team here can remove the quiz. So Resilience UK, my apologies. So Resilience UK, our ambition is to help every UK community to be self-sufficient for the first 72 hours of an emergency event. It's a really big ambition. So when you break that down into what a local area, a group of people, a community need in order to be able to do that, there's a lot that comes into play. And so we found that working with communities, just saying, have you got an emergency plan, kind of sent shivers. And so what we've developed is a kind of incremental approach to this. And it's important to say that with that 72 hours, it's quite possible for a community to be resilient for up to 72 hours for one emergency event. But as we have seen over a significant period of time, we've been dealing with floods for the first part of the year. We're in a heat wave now. We've got power outages. We've had wildfires. I'm based in York. We've had wildfires on the North York Moors at scale for the first time. And so all of these things come into play as to how we support communities and what information they need, and then what information we can gather. So this session, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through the way we work in terms of how we deploy the maturity index, and then the data we get from that. And hopefully you'll find it useful. Now, the one thing I want to say about this is, at the moment, we find that most communities that are really, really good at responding to emergency events are communities that have experienced those emergency events. So it tends to be a reaction. And the problem now is we're seeing so many more emergency events, more flooding, and so on, we don't have time for every community to experience a terrible event and then learn from it. So we need to be able to help communities that are at risk to be able to respond to it without having to experience it themselves. So let's look at communities and how we're defining them. So we have approximately across England and Wales, approximately 10,500 sort of statutory communities that, if you like, parish would be an example of those sorts of things. Now, we don't define communities in any particular way. We allow communities to define themselves. And so we know that there are far more communities than are listed on the map. And so what we have to do is we have to look at how communities define themselves and how they work together. So the complexity with that is in one geographical area, you may have multiple communities that are all operating in the same geographic area, but define themselves either through faith or through geography or through culture and history or through proximity to risk, such as a river. And then each of those need to be able to ensure that they have the bases covered so that they're able to support their own communities. So our focus is in three areas: engagement. So we use the tool to help local authorities and those represented local authorities, such as the Local Resilience Forum and the VCS community, engage those communities. We provide support for those communities to become more resilient by producing a report, which you'll see in a few moments. And then we can measure the impact by completing the diagnostic twice and then measuring the increase in their capability over that time. There is no other measure available that actually engages communities, that asks them how resilient they are or what they're doing. And the nearest closest measure is principally based on socio-political and socio-economic data. And so it looks at things like areas of multiple deprivation, it looks at housing stock, Polar 4 data, number of people going to university, and it takes huge numbers of bits of data and aggregates them into a measure of the likelihood that a community can recover from an emergency event. So it doesn't do the prepare for, respond to, it just does the recover from, and then gives it a resilience score based on that. And that particular measure uses a local area district as a measure of community, and that is approximately 142,000 people on average. And so that's a lot to be trying to make a judgment as to whether that community is itself resilient. Whereas we know this diagnostic is used for a street of 10 houses next to a brook in North Somerset, for example, and those are self-defining as that community. So let me just, with the wizardry of my computer, let me just take you into the diagnostic itself. So this is the Community Resilience Maturity Index. As I said, it's developed from some commercial models we have in another company. But I started with my background, strategic HR. So I support small companies to grow into bigger companies. And one of the things I noticed when I was working with local communities and their flood wardens is that they build very much like a small business. So they have resources that they need, they have communication methodologies, they have leaders, they have training, they have recruitment process, and then they have work to do, so putting up flood barriers and so on and so forth. And so seeing how that evolved in one particular community in the southwest over a 10-year period, when they learnt from events such as Boscastle and so on, it was possible to see that there was a maturity model that you could develop through that process, and that's where we started with this. And so I want to just take you through if you were to sign up for this yourself, there's a little bit of putting your name and your email address, and I've just skipped all that. So we're just using this voucher code. And so we can click on the Community Resilience Maturity Index and press confirm. And so I want to take you through this so you can see some of the detail of how it's built, but also how easy it is for people to use. So we have in the CRMI these sections. So we have people, systems, processes, resources, communication, leadership, post-event actions and analysis. And then there's some additional questions at the end, which I'll come on to. Now, anyone who attends this workshop, I can have them sent a voucher code, so you can look at this in your own time for free and go through it all the detail. So we won't go through line by line, but we'll just start with the people section. And so the way this works is we have a statement. So in this instance, the first statement, we have a team of trained volunteers that cover all role requirements. And then the community is asked to score themselves on a scale of 0, nothing in place, through to 4, in place and highly effective. And it's really important that people think about whether things are effective, because having something in place doesn't necessarily mean that it's highly effective. So we are asking people to make a judgment of the efficacy of what they have in place, and ideally to encourage them to test so that they know that these things are effective and in place. So I won't go through these line by line, but I'll cover some of them and the broad sections. And what we do is sort of a connect 4 board. So we can score ourselves in each of these sections. And then once we've completed that, we can click on to the next section. So we can now look at systems and processes. So do we have key data for agencies? Do we have a flexible organizational structure, and so on? So we can, again, give ourselves a score on this, and we'll pretend that we're really high scoring on some of these, just so I can show you the report at the end. Resources, again, equipment, protective clothing, publicized place of safety, control center if you have one, robust systems, all those sorts of things that need to be in place in order for the community to be able to respond to an event. And then communication. So back in the day, we used to have cascading, didn't we? So on the landline, you'd call 3 neighbours and they'd call 3 neighbours, and now we can have a WhatsApp group with everybody in it, and a single phone that the emergency services or the local authority are aware of, and that can be, as is in some cases, the flood phone in some villages and so on. So communication has been enabled with modern technologies, and it's important that communities are able to keep up with that. So then we introduced this leadership section as a response to a number of pilots that we ran, where people understood that they weren't quite where they needed to be, but they didn't know where to go. And so having a level of leadership where it's around knowledge of where the resources are is as important as having the resources themselves. So some communities we worked with, their score increased dramatically simply by knowing that the local authority had a bunch of resources that they otherwise previously weren't aware of. And then post-event actions and analysis are really important because we learn from the events as they happen. And so we can click and submit. Now we've got green ticks all the way. There is this additional question. So we add in a tick box. So if a community wants specific help in a particular area and wants to highlight that, they can click any of these, and that flags on our system, and then we can make sure that they're directed to appropriate support. And then we can submit that one, submit the whole thing, and then pretty much straight away we have a report that's generated. So this report is based on a database at the back end with lots and lots of different sentences that all get pulled together based on the responses within the system. And so we have a score. So this is scored 62 out of 120, and that has placed me in this instance as functioning, which is the 3rd highest level of maturity. So the 3rd quintile. So transactional, reactive, functioning, established, or leading. This one is functioning. So for all of our diagnostics, we have characteristics. So given what you've responded, these are the characteristics that we're likely to see in your community. And this came from my work with human resources and people development. So I'll give you an example. So when I work with companies and I say, what does your HR function look like? If they say it's half of somebody's job in finance, I can pretty much tell you how terrible everything else is going to be, because there's a way in which organizations work where if people in HR sit under the finance function, it's very unlikely that they're investing in leadership development, management training, anything more than compliance-based training and development and appraisals and so on. And so you get a sense with the knowledge that you build up around what a community in this case or an organization might look like based on their responses. So given that, and we can understand the characteristics, we then have the risks. So it's likely that more, in this instance, more volunteers needed, that maybe look at different areas of emergency event rather than just focusing on one, and therefore you need X, Y, Z. And this is where the recommendations come in. So we can then put in recommendations of, given that you're at this stage, we recommend you do these things. And then this particular one we've been using with Lincolnshire and Norfolk, but the diagnostic itself, so all of the statements remain the same, but the report can be tailored for each local authority area. So every local authority can have its own version with its own links to its own resources, and it can be branded so that it becomes part of the tools and the infrastructure that's used, so it becomes more friendly. So rather than it looking like an external tool, it looks like part of the whatever local authority, West Yorkshire, prepared kind of bunch of resources, and it's all branded the same, and so we can facilitate that. So once you've got through the sort of headlines, you then have a score here on a rows diagram, which shows areas. So where the score is higher, that's generally better. This is RAG rated, so there's no green on this at the moment, but there is red, amber, green. So the focus on here should be around post-event actions and analysis. And that's the same information on the bar chart. And then for each of the sections, there's more detail with links to organisations. We work with Communities Prepared and the British Red Cross and others to develop this the content within here. So all of these run through for each of the sections with more and more detail, and then each of those scores. And we'll come on to looking at how we utilise this in a second. This system, the report is downloadable as a PDF, so it can be completed by a senior flood warden or whatever, and then shared across the community. And we would ideally like communities to do this multiple times over the course of a year and to see their incremental improvement. I'm going to just go back to my slide deck, but I'm happy to just pause if there are any questions that pop up in the chat just about that, bearing in mind I am going to now come on to how we use some of the data in there. But if there's any burning questions, I'm happy to have a look at those now. So the questions came from working directly with communities rather than any assessment tool or that joint R&D project that you look at. So these were tested with multiple communities over a period of time. We've had about 120 communities go through the process as part of our pilots. So just as an overview, so this is how, this is not comprehensive, so this is just a snapshot, but each of these levels of maturity, we're helping communities to make incremental steps. So transactional reactive, probably no emergency or flood plan in place. There's a primary focus on managing events as they happen, likely to be a small team of volunteers. And then as you move up the scale, there's more likely to be beginnings, an outline of a flood plan, or one in place, and then coordinated activities. And what we see over time is that communities change in the way they do things. So quite often you'll have a community that's got an established flood team, for example, and then people start to retire from the volunteering roles. And it's really hard to replace them like for like, because there were a few volunteers doing very many things, and now they're moving to models where it's more volunteers each doing fewer things. And so this has been kind of an evolution, so people can move up and down the maturity index based on how the world around them is changing as well. I think it would be interesting to get this second poll up now, and just I'd like people to ask, is knowing a level of resilience for a particular geography, would that be important in the work that you're doing. I'm not selling the data, by the way. That's not the point of this. I'm just we've always assumed that knowing that people are aware is different to knowing that people can cope. Um, That's great. I mean, I did look at the list of attendees, and it's we've got a good range of job roles and organisations. So it would be really interesting at some point to know kind of how these uh, levels of maturity would be valuable or useful for you guys. Thank you for that. Okay, so I think that's a really good indication of how important those sorts of things can be. Okay, so let me get into the data, and let me just show you how we how this aggregates up. I think that's a really important thing to understand, kind of how the different levels of individual or organization benefit from it. I'm going to use West Yorkshire as an example. So here we have a little community on the west of West Yorkshire called Blackshaw. Now, I've not particularly picked Blackshaw for any specific reason, but Blackshaw has, at the last poll, last census, 2011, 992 people in Blackshaw. And so they may consider themselves one community, or depending on risks and events, they may have different groups of people that consider themselves a community in those. So we may have one or two CRMI results from Blackshaw. Okay, so Blackshaw is then within the metropolitan borough of Calderdale. Right? So in that district, if you like, that sort of local authority level, they're in Calderdale. Now we're at 210, 211,000 people at that point. So we would have multiple Blackshaw equivalents feeding up into Calderdale, which then feeds up into the wider West Yorkshire area, which is around 2.4 million people. So how do you determine whether West Yorkshire or Calderdale is resilient? I think the only way you can do it is to start at the ground level and ask the local communities and support them in understanding their levels of resilience, and then build that knowledge up into a bigger picture. So here we might have so this is actual real data, but we're not telling you where from, because that's not the relevant bit. So we've got sort of one local authority area with 30 communities here. The average score is 37. Sorry, it says operational, but we changed the, oh no, 37, so it's operational, yes. So the second tier up is the average. We've got some which are performing quite well, so they're needing perhaps less support, and then we have a whole range sort of in the middle, and quite a few at the transactional level. So that's a really nice sort of snapshot of one area, but this is how it works. Okay, so we have each of those communities, so 30 plus communities across West Yorkshire LRF in Bradford, Calderdale, Kirklees, Leeds, Wakefield, and each of those aggregate up into a sort of district, metropolitan borough, and then up into LRF area, and then that can be taken national. So we could take the 42 LRFs and lump them together and give the UK a score. And actually, we as an organisation sit on the UK Resilience Academy working group on measuring whole of society resilience, and in fact hold the pen on the chapter around community resilience, because we're trying to find a way to measure community resilience. So this, as well as the socioeconomic, socio-political data, can all feed in to give us a really clear view. So let's have a look at how we're using this at a local level. So this is sort of the meaty bit. So this is a real community, so this is real data, and this was their initial score. So really low across the board on all of the areas, but with some systems and processes in place. So if we then take resources as the example, so they scored 0 on all of the scores, all of the statements around resources. So we have a comprehensive and robust system to understand how to be alerted, our equipment and protective clothing is stored, etc. And so they've identified an area of need. And with that knowledge, they can go to the local authority or whoever's working with the local authority, the VCS community, and say, we need help in this area. And that's such an important extra step that has not been there before. So do you have a flood plan or an emergency plan? Yes or no? If it's no, where do I start? And being handed a template flood plan is really quite daunting for a lot of people. And so, but going through this and being able to say, actually, we don't have these things in place. This is what we need help with, and being able to contact the community engagement or emergency planning team and say, this is what we need support with, has helped this particular community to increase its scores quite markedly. So this was September 2024, some concerted effort. January 25, you can see that they have improved across all areas, but in resources in particular, they have stepped up from all zeros to twos and threes. And so that demonstrates that a focused input supported by a local authority can really make a difference at the hyper-local level. And so when we look at data, I think quite a few people like the idea of an overarching score, but I really like being able to get into this hyper-local, that we know that this one community has improved their score in one section of 6, and that they could do that for all of them. And if everybody can do that, we are going to end up with a more resilient society overall. One of the areas that we have been working with in communities is looking at what changes are being made incrementally or big step changes. And so I just want to give you a couple of examples. So when in one community, it was slightly facetious, but they sort of knew they were flooded because they looked out the window and the river was rising and it was still raining. And so there's a point where the river used to reach a certain point, and that triggered a set of actions for people to go out and put up floodboards and move vehicles and alert vulnerable people and so on. And that could be at 2 in the morning, it could be 4 in the morning, it could be 2 in the afternoon, just depended on the weather. That same community, I think 3 years on, they now have radar telemetry on the bridge, which when the river hits a certain level and the weather is wet, it triggers individual alerts on individual apps in individual households to say, you need to move your vehicle, you need to put your floodboards. And then there is also a list of vulnerable people. So they can call to say, I need to help putting my floodboard up or putting sandbags out or whatever it may be. But that move from 4 or 5 people going out and covering the whole of the village through to individuals taking responsibility, but with support, with the technology that can alert people, so that nobody has to go out in the dead of night because they've got the data and the information to show beforehand. We also have communities that have undertaken the CRMI, realised where they could improve. And one community has decided that they are going to make sure there's a first aider on every street. And that's not because they think they're going to encounter lots and lots of medical emergencies, but it's to ensure that they don't call an ambulance unnecessarily. So you can make an informed choice about how to use category responders and when to bring them in, and when you can be self-sufficient. And that's a real step change in ensuring that resources can be deployed where they're needed most and are not just called. And we've seen examples of this where entire river systems flood and people think they're having a really bad time because they're very, very wet, but actually there's a threat to life further upstream. And so the resources are going there and they're like, why haven't we got support here? And local authorities don't have the resources to go out to every event. And so if there are, 3 major events, that's probably more than most local authorities could reasonably cope with. So for local authorities, we can have a look across the different sections for the different communities. This is real data, but this was taken from our first pilot, so it doesn't include the leadership section. So apologies, there is a gap there, but I didn't want to just make up data and put it in just for prettiness. So we can then, for a local authority, we are trying to help either the local authority themselves or the people that they work with to support community engagement and community resilience to focus on where the resource is put and the decisions are made around training, and move away from webinars that try to cover everything but don't cover anything in sufficient detail. And so that once you know that you've got, you know, it's possible to see that sort of overall resources scores quite low, people as well, and so it's possible to develop those materials, develop that webinar, put some training on, run a resilience day, whatever it may be, but focused in on where overall there is a low score, or in this example, communities A and B and C really need some help, right? Because they're not scoring anything at all other than in systems and processes. And so the local authority has access to the name and the contact details for the community, so they can get in touch and say, I see you've done the CRMI, would you like some support in these areas? Or they can look at the aggregated overall data and go out to the whole of the communities and say, right, we can see generally speaking there's a low score across people or resources. We're going to run an event or put out some training on those things. Sign up if you are interested. Yeah. So this is from our original, one of our original pilots, and this is we're not here yet, but this is where we want to get to. So this is North Norfolk, and I've coloured in the map. So for my aim is for each local authority, each LRF, they could have a map of their area showing the maturity level. So this was the first time they went through the diagnostic, and then this is the second time, and there's just a slight change. The scores went up on average by 18%, which is nearly one maturity level. And what I would really like to be able to do is then layer over risk. So if you've got levels of resilience and then you can then layer over risk, you can see where to hone in and where to focus. Because if you've got low levels of resilience and high levels of risk, then you've got that really dangerous mismatch. And I've been talking to some of the data guys that I work with, and one of the things that we think we're going to be able to do is create this polygon mapping where we map the individual communities, give it a resilience score, and then map flood risk and have a slider to show what happens if river levels rise by 1 meter, 2 meter, 3 meter, 4 meter, and so on. And see which communities are affected, and then see how resilient they are, and see what they've got in place, and then be able to support them either through defensive strategies or through resilient strategies. So I think that starts to then get into a really exciting hyper local through to national scale risk versus resilience mapping exercise that enables a dedicated and streamlined focus of resources. So the decision making is based on the data known in each of those communities, rather than just an overall, well, we think everybody should have a flood plan, everybody should have an emergency plan, and everybody should know who the vulnerable people are. And so it drills down into those level of details. So overall, we see an improvement in time, an improvement in resilience scores over time, but focused in on particular areas. And it generally, the pattern seems to be communities get very resilient in managing one event, their most likely event. So, for example, flooding or coastal flooding. But in North Norfolk, for example, they're at the end of a gas line. So there is no way to reroute gas. So if gas stops travelling through the gas lines, there's a bigger problem in that part of the country than there is in others. In North Yorkshire, we have risks associated with transporting toxic chemicals from Teesside through to the major motorway network. So there are plans in place for that. I was talking to some representatives of the Scottish government. They were asking if we could work with them to map all of the communities along the A9 so that they could see where the rest centres were, so that when there's a major traffic incident or major weather event that benights vehicles on the A9, where can they house people who are stranded in their vehicles so they don't have to stay on the road. So all of those things come together to show a really smart way of mapping and addressing risk and building resilience. So we the way this works, I mean, if anybody's interested, the way it works is we license this to local authorities, but then the local communities can access this free of charge. And there's kind of a fair use policy on it, but it is free for communities to use as much as they like. So if they wanted to do this every month, they absolutely could do that. And then just finally, for the this part on local community, on local authorities or that level of aggregated data, this is where you can see an improvement or otherwise. So I'm afraid it's not a terribly clear chart, but you can see that where communities have taken it twice, there are two charts above their letter, and that's where it's showing an improvement. So L, for example, stayed the same. That's actually two bars the same. N improved markedly, I improved a little bit, and so on and so forth. So you can start to see that improvement across the communities in your area. And then I just want to draw your attention to some really nice testimonials we've had. This is 4 of about 30 or 40 that we've had, which are really positive about the work we've been doing. And particularly if I can draw your attention to Cheshire. Specifically, the reports received on our communities gave us greater insight into detail that we've never seen before. And that's the point. This is what we're trying to do, is to give local communities, empower them to make good decisions about how to improve their resilience, and then give local authorities and LRFs the data to be able to have that overview and drive the resources to the place where it's going to have the most effect, so that we are utilising public funds in the best ways we possibly can. I would like to, I think it would just be interesting now to, let me just get my question, my sincere apologies. So I think I'm quite happy to open it up to discussion now, and I can stop sharing the slide, but have a think about this question first, please. So what information, if you could, would you like to gather from communities or impart to communities? So our system, this isn't a pitch, I'm genuinely interested to know, because we've gone down a very particular route of emergency planning and community resilience, but we're also acutely aware that there's lots of work going on where communities are being supported and defended through flood prevention measures, and there's different information that you would probably like to impart or gather from communities. And so I'd be really interested to know what information you think would be useful. I'm quite happy for that to go in the chat, and we can start a conversation about it, or we can just unmute everybody and have a free for all. I'm quite content, but I'd really like to get a sense of where people are and whether they think, one, this has been useful, and two, if they think this sort of level of data is useful in the work that they're doing. Yeah, so the question about is the resource fairly new? Yes, it is. So it's been developed over the last couple of years and piloted. We went out with an enhanced pilot at the beginning of the year, so that was our first sort of first time where we asked for money, and now we are from this financial year we are licensing it to local authorities and LRFs. So this is our first sort of full year of of operation, if you like. We're still a very small community interest company. The whole tool is online. It's we've deliberately built it so that it's kind of a self-managed tool. So we give access, and whoever holds the license is able to upload their logos and links to resources and so on. But yeah, we've, as I say, we've tested it with about 120 communities so far, and got some excellent feedback and made some changes, obviously. Um, yes, excellent. So the details of vulnerabilities, that's a really tricky one, isn't it? In that how you hold that, maintain it, keep it secure, keep it up to date, but don't expose people as being vulnerable in their own homes. I did hear one story where one community advocated putting a big red cross in the window if they were vulnerable, and it just alerted all the scallies in the area to the fact that there was a vulnerable person in the house. And so that was backtracked on really quite quickly. Cost of the license is for an LRF, it's 11,500 a year, and then there's a small setup cost of £1,500 per instance, and it's 5,500 per local authority. We have other diagnostics commercially which cost way more, so we're very happy to be able to do this as not for profit to keep the cost down. So the communities are effectively self-defined. So they could be literally, Tunbridge Close as a street in a village, or it could be the parish itself, depending on how that's structured. So what we tend to find is that where communities have been hit by an emergency event, there tends to be a better organisation around those communities. So it tends to be sort of senior volunteers that coordinate on behalf and galvanize the different parts of a community. But then we also know in villages that some people at the top of a street that floods don't know that there are flood wardens at the bottom of the street that come out and high vis and support those living by the river. So and I know one in North Yorkshire where there's a row of, I think, so it's something like 6 railway cottages, and although they never get flooded, they get cut off, and so there's one person in one house who supports all the others because they've just built their sort of community support in that way. Now they could arguably be part of a bigger community, but we also know in London, in some of those areas, we have, we might have a Senegalese population, a faith-based population, a local sort of neighbourhood group. There may be a night shift workers group that all meet on a regular basis, and they consider themselves their own communities and they look after each other, and therefore we would have data, sort of multi-layered data for one geographical area. We don't mind that. It can be a bit messy, but it's the truth of how those local areas work. Yeah, awareness of flood risks is really important. So we've been working quite closely with British Red Cross and Henry Barnes there in particular, and with Flood Mary, and bringing these resources in. And then, I mean, ultimately, it would be really nice for us to be able to direct people to solutions as well. But we're not in a, we're not in a place to sort of be issuing equipment, so to speak. That's not our role as a CIC, and we are not here to replace the training that's provided by Communities Prepared, for example. But we work closely with them, and they've adapted a lot of their training to be more focused based on the evidence that comes out of the work that we've been doing with them. So interestingly, yes, the long-term flood risks, and looking at those areas, we know it was an economist from Northern Powerhouse was talking at an event I was at, and he was saying that we've still got this sort of cognitive dissonance around flooding, and we're building properties now which he referred to as being 3 mortgage cycles away from subaqueous dwellings. So we know that in 75 years they're going to be underwater, and they're still building houses on it, and so on that land. And so you know, to some extent, we're trying to help communities become more resilient with the hand they've been dealt, given where we are, and But then also we're creating communities in places where the risk is higher, and I make no sort of particular judgment on that, but I think it increases the challenges, doesn't it? I'd be interested to know if anybody from overseas, if there's similar sorts of uh, ways of gathering data in the countries in which you operate. I noticed from the attendee list that not everybody was UK based, and so we're at the moment we're UK based. In fact, we're initially focused England and Wales, and we're in talks because Scotland operates slightly differently. We're reworking the model a bit for that area, um, but the diagnostic tool is eminently editable and can be translated and so on. So it would be really interesting to know if similar sorts of things exist. I know that the Schumacher Institute has been doing some work around resilience overseas, but I don't think it's sort of asking local communities at a hyperlocal level. And I know there's obviously research that's been doing through Centre for Societal Resilience and so on, and Manchester University and others, but that tends to be, and it's good research, but it tends to be working with a very small number of communities in a very detailed and you know, qualitative way, rather than more detailed at a hyperlocal level. So yes, if anybody's from outside the UK and knows of anything that's similar, I'd be really interested to know. We are interested in working with academic partners to start building up a kind of you know, piece of research on the data we've got, and also if you're working in commercial organisations, if you know we don't sell the data, so we've been really clear that there's a real risk that if you know how resilient a community is, that that can affect insurance premiums. So we've agreed to not simply not sell the data. The data at the hyper-local community level is available at the local authority level and the LRF level to license holders who have kind of responsibility from a statutory perspective to those local communities. But there's nothing to say that data couldn't be collected on behalf of another organisation if it was out there. But it would just be interesting to know kind of the commercial organisations that have joined, what sort of data would be potentially beneficial for you, and whether it's around resilience itself, or whether it's around a capability, or whether it's around a preference. So how risks are managed, for example. There are obviously different ways of managing risks, and are the communities engaged in making decisions around which way would be best for them. So a question that came in earlier, which I didn't spot, my apologies. So how much time on average are local authorities needing to spend with each community? So the completing the CRMI takes around 10 minutes, and generally this prevents a local authority from having to spend too much time. We were working with one local authority, and somebody there was charged with visiting 500 communities, and going and having the same conversations with 500 different communities is very, very time consuming. What you could do as an alternative is to send out the link to the CRMI to everyone, bring it all back in, and then communicate out based on the responses. And so generally speaking, we find that local authorities where community engagement is key and they do it a lot, this saves time. And where local authorities are finding it hard to engage, this has enabled engagement where otherwise they've found it difficult to do that, because they have a purpose and the local community gets something from it because they get to keep the report. So it's not just a questionnaire that's in the ether that they respond to and never see the results from. But what they don't see, and it's important to see, is that the communities don't see their neighbouring communities. So they're welcome to share, but that's their own. So this isn't a competition. So we're not looking at scoring and challenging one against another or seeing how they are. But I do think it is interesting at the emergency planning level to be able to track communities down, say, a flood basin, and see where the weak spots might be and where the focus could be to improve and support. So yeah, on average, it's 10 minutes to complete, and but it leads to a more robust and fulfilling conversation, which is based on obviously the data and the responses that local community has. And if they don't score very highly, that's not no particular reflection, but it is a way of enabling a starting point to say, okay, well, these are the things that you need to focus on. Where do we go first? Is it getting some volunteers and seeing where we go from there? Is it writing a plan? Is it but at least they have a place to start and then a way of measuring impact after that. If anybody would like a sort of home demonstration, then I can send out a voucher code, which is free for you to use. You can use it in anger with the community if you're working with them, or just have a go at it, have a look through, and see what you think. And if anybody wants to chat more about the tool itself, the data, then more than happy to give demonstrations and talk about it. It's yeah, I find it a very enjoyable part of my work. And I see a couple of LinkedIn requests coming in. I'm on LinkedIn, Gareth Priest UK, so or just Gareth Priest. I think I'm so old that I was one of the first in on Gareth Priest is in LinkedIn. So and Resilience UK is on LinkedIn as a page as well. So if you want to follow that, we do occasionally provide some updates. Other than that, ResilienceUK.UK is the website, but we do have a few minutes left, so I'm quite happy to hang about if there are some other questions. But I have shared with you what I wanted to share with you today. I hope it's been useful and enjoyable and informative. Thank you.